Travis Scott has a big problem. It's been almost a year since Utopia dropped, and what was supposed to be the second coming of Astroworld ended up becoming just a solid album. And though the record isn't bad, it also doesn't carry the cultural significance that I think most people thought the record was going to have. Which made me realize that Travis Scott has a cultural problem. And to explain that, let me take a step back to 2018. The year is 2018, and hip-hop was having one of the best years in the decade as a whole. Whether you were a mainstream hip-hop fan, a lyrical hip-hop fan, or an experimental hip-hop fan, 2018 had what you needed the most. It's technically the last year that J. Cole, Drake, and Kendrick Lamar would release an album in the same year if you count the Black Panther album, but it also had a lot of other stuff. Kanye released Ye and teamed up with Kid Cudi on Kids See Ghosts. He produced Daytona and those other two albums we don't really talk about. But Daytona was considered to be one of the best hip hop albums that year. And despite it being released 6 years ago, it still gets brought up today as the catalyst for the Pusha T Drake feud that took up the summer. Or at least the beef that would have took up the summer if Pusha T hadn't ethered Drake in May. It had many wondering, how can Drake come back from this? And then Drake showed how he came back from that. Louisiana shit. And on the younger side of the coin, 2018 was also kind of a transitional year for hip-hop. JID was breaking into the mainstream thanks to his XXL freestyle. XXXTentacion showed a lot of potential before being killed, and in death he became one of the biggest rappers in the world, while Juice WRLD showed that he also had potential. And if you're wondering why I'm bringing all of this up to talk about Astroworld, it's because the success of Astroworld was a microcosm of the success that hip-hop was experiencing. And without the success of hip-hop, it's a record that wouldn't work in the same way. And I mean, just take a look at the track list. Frank Ocean, Drake, Sway Lee, James Blake, Kid Cudi, Philip Bailey, Stevie Wonder, Juice WRLD, Check West, Pharrell Williams, Tame Impala, The Weeknd, 21 Savage, Gunna, Nav, Don Toliver, Quavo, Takeoff. And yeah, maybe not all of those are the hottest rappers around. Stevie Wonder isn't even a rapper as far as I know. But I feel like it was symbolic of what made hip-hop cool at the time. Amidst of the young, the old, and the people in their primes. And I think that is what makes Astroworld such a special album, and what makes it so indicative of the time period. However, I feel like I can't say the same about Utopia. But before we get into that, make sure to like the video if you've liked what you've seen so far, and make sure to subscribe as well. I appreciate all types of support.
Baby, please get off the gram. I like you better in the stands.
After 5 years without a solo studio album from Travis Scott, people were waiting and hyping up this record like nothing else. It was by far the most anticipated record in all of hip-hop, and people anxiously waited. In fact, I went as far as to say that Travis Scott's Utopia was a make or break album in his legacy. Mostly because if you rewind a few years back and you think about the Astroworld tragedies, nobody outside of hip-hop really wanted to listen to Travis Scott. And his response to the whole ordeal just made the black eye even bigger in terms of his legacy.
I just want to send out prayers to the ones that was lost last night. We're actually working right now to identify the families so we can help assist them through this tough time.
However, after waiting it out for a few years, Travis Scott decided to drop Utopia in July of 2023.
Okay, this shit is out of control.
However, when we contrast what 2023 looked like compared to 2018, you run into a bit of a problem. In 2018, hip-hop was the biggest genre in the world. In 2023, a lot of people question whether hip-hop was dead. And that might be dramatic looking back, because it definitely was. I was trying to tell people all the time, hey, hip-hop is not dead, but everybody was telling me that hip-hop was dead, blah, blah, blah. What I won't deny, though, is that hip-hop was in its most boring point since I've been a fan.
He said I'm good enough.
This is mostly because of the butterfly effect from the pandemic. Everybody was so thirsty to put out an album just after the pandemic that 2023 just kind of became a wasteland. Outside of Utopia, there were no major releases that really generated buzz. Like, one of the most notable rap albums of the first half of 2023 was the deluxe version of Call Me If You Get Lost, a record that came out 2 years prior to 2023. On top of that, in terms of young up-and-comers, outside of Ice Spice and and Setsy Red, maybe Tizo touchdown, there were none. And with Double XL not breaking ground the way it used to, Genius not being as relevant as it was in 2018, and World Star Hip Hop essentially becoming a graveyard, how were rappers supposed to blow up? And again, you might be wondering why I'm talking about the culture and the landscape of hip hop in 2023 to explain why Utopia might not have been as successful as Astroworld. But again, when you're listening to a Travis Scott record, you're not just listening to Travis Scott, you're listening to a moment in time. In retrospect, when you look at a record like Rodeo and keep in mind what would happen throughout the next 2 to 3 years after the record's release, we can see that the record was way ahead of its time.
My granny called, she said, Travis, you work too hard, I'm worried you forget about me.
It was that bridge from the early 2010s level of rap to the late 2010s.
Now that I'm home, back up the road.
To me, Astroworld was the symbol of how the late 2010s became the era where hip-hop was the biggest genre in the country.
For this life I cannot change.
And probably the biggest genre in the world as well. And the reason why Travis Scott is able to do this is because he pulls from so many different areas of hip-hop. And in terms of bringing all these people together and assembling the Avengers, for example, I don't think there's anybody better than Travis Scott.
So sad.
However, when the culture isn't doing as good as it was in 2018, this formula seems way more limited than it is. All of the sudden, instead of getting an album that's symbolic of everything that's great in hip-hop at the current moment, get an album that, although is good in its own way, ends up being forgotten by a lot of people. This is the case for Utopia.
Swish.
A record that, though good, will be forgotten by most people as the years go on, mainly because of that lack of spectacle that an album like Astroworld or Rodeo had. And I'd even go as far as to say that Birds in the Trap Sing McKnight had more staying power than Utopia did.
I get those goosebumps every time.
And trust me when I say that is not the fault of Travis Scott for the most part. But when it comes to Travis Scott and the problem that Travis Scott has, the records that he produces are only gonna be as remembered as the era that they come out in. And I mean, sure, that's something that impacts every rapper. But I feel like Travis Scott in particular, Travis Scott is the rapper that's impacted the most when it comes to the landscape around him. However, the good thing is that hip-hop is in a way better place than it was just a year ago. And there is no better time for a Travis Scott album than right now. But maybe I'm wrong. Anyways, if you'd like to see a video where I do talk about Astroworld more in depth, there should be one on the screen. But anyways, if you've been keeping up with the channel, the Kendrick Lamar and J. Cole video is definitely on the way. It's about 5 minutes edited right now. I'm aiming for 20 minutes, but this shit might hit like 25, 30. Anyways though, shout out to Jay Dilla, shout out to me, shout out to y'all, shout out to God, and shout out to Travis Scott, honestly. And yeah.